On a summer morning in 1977, a man facing murder charges walked into a Colorado courthouse in custody, and then, in the middle of normal court business, he vanished. Not through a tunnel, not with a weapon, not with a riot. He used something far more common, and far more dangerous, inside real institutions. Routine, trust, and a brief gap between policy and practice. And while this case includes a dramatic courthouse window escape, this is not a story meant to celebrate cleverness. It's a warning. Because when custody fails, the cost is paid by real people, not by buildings. Today, on the Escape Files, the 1977 Colorado courthouse escape of Ted Bundy, how it happened twice, and the lives that were lost because the system didn't adapt fast enough. Before we begin, a note on how we'll tell this story. This case involves real victims and families who suffered immeasurable loss. I'm going to keep details factual, but not graphic. The goal is understanding what happened, and what security lessons were ignored, not turning tragedy into spectacle. By the mid-1970s, investigators across multiple states believed they were tracking the same offender, someone connected to the disappearances and murders of young women in Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. Ted Bundy was already in custody on kidnapping charges in Utah, and Colorado prosecutors wanted him in court for a major case, the murder of Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse who disappeared from a ski resort in Snowmass, Colorado, in January 1975. Her skull was found months later in the mountains, showing evidence of blunt force trauma. Bundy's danger wasn't just physical violence, it was behavioral. He was capable of exploiting professional trust cues, studying security routines, and using legal processes to create opportunities for escape. In other words, he didn't need chaos, he needed normalcy. So here are the questions that drive this entire episode. How did a courthouse, in daylight, become an exit route? Why did the same person escape twice using completely different methods? And most importantly, what were the human consequences when the system failed to adapt? Most viewers already know the name Ted Bundy, so we'll focus only on what's operationally relevant to understanding how the escapes happened. Bundy understood institutions. He wasn't just observing buildings, he was studying human behavior. He watched schedules, staff rotations, when people were distracted, when they were confident, and critically, when they made assumptions based on appearance rather than risk assessment. He also understood legal procedure. As someone who had studied law and worked in political campaigns, he knew how to present himself as cooperative, educated, and reasonable. He pushed for privileges that sound legitimate on paper, access to legal materials, time to prepare a defense, some independence while working on his case. In a fair justice system, those privileges exist for important reasons. They protect the right to a defense. But when a defendant is assessed incorrectly, when risk is underestimated because someone looks professional and speaks well, those same privileges can become exposure points. And that's exactly what happened in Colorado. Because Ted Bundy didn't look like what people imagined a violent offender should look like. And that cognitive dissonance, that gap between appearance and reality, became his greatest weapon. The Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, was not a prison. It was a working public building in a small mountain town. It had hallways, offices, stairwells, a law library. It had normal doors, normal windows, normal foot traffic, lawyers, clerks, visitors, defendants. And that environment created a fundamentally different risk profile than a jail or prison. In a courthouse, security often relies on layered controls rather than heavy physical fortification. For a high-risk defendant, those layers should include a restraints policy matched to the assessed risk level. That means handcuffs, leg irons, or both, depending on the threat. Continuous observation during any movement. Not a guard nearby, but true line-of-sight supervision, where the defendant is never out of view. Controlled access to rooms, especially rooms with windows or exterior access points. Physical hardening where necessary, such as window locks, reinforced glass, or barriers that prevent opening. Frequent presence confirmation, meaning staff verify the defendant's location regularly, not only during scheduled events like hearings or meal times. If even one of those layers is weak or missing, a determined person doesn't need a complex plan. They need one opening, one moment where procedure doesn't match the risk. Viewer prediction question. If you were responsible for courthouse security, what would you check first in a second-floor law library? The doors, the windows, or the sightlines to ensure constant observation? In early June 1977, Ted Bundy was being transported regularly from the Garfield County Jail to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for pretrial hearings. And Bundy had successfully argued to the judge that he should be allowed to represent himself. This wasn't unusual. Defendants have a constitutional right to self-representation. But that right came with privileges, access to the law library, time to review case files, and critically, permission to move within certain areas of the courthouse without being fully restrained. On the morning of June 7, 1977, Bundy was brought to the courthouse for a hearing. During a break, he asked permission to use the law library on the second floor to prepare his defense. Guards allowed it. The law library was a small room with bookshelves, a table, and windows. It wasn't designed as a secure holding area. It was a workspace. Around 11 a.m., Bundy was alone in the library. A guard was stationed in the hallway, nearby but not directly observing him. And that's when Bundy moved. He opened a window. Looked down. The drop was significant, roughly 20 to 25 feet to the ground below. There was grass and some landscaping, but it was still a dangerous fall. Bundy climbed onto the window ledge and jumped. He hit the ground hard, injuring his ankle, but adrenaline kept him moving. He got up and ran. And here's the part that shows how appearance affects response. Bundy was wearing civilian clothes, a dress shirt and slacks, because he was acting as his own attorney. So when people in the small town of Aspen saw a man running, some waved, thinking he was a lawyer late for an appointment. Within minutes, Ted Bundy had disappeared into the Colorado wilderness. It took guards approximately 15 minutes to realize he was missing. By then, he had a significant head start. Now let's break down what failed. No continuous line of sight observation. The guard was nearby, but Bundy was out of view long enough to reach the window, open it, and escape. The room wasn't hardened. The window could be opened freely. There were no locks, no alarms, no barriers. Risk assessment didn't match privilege level. Bundy was facing a murder charge and had a history of manipulation. But he was given movement freedom based on his appearance and demeanor, not his actual threat level. Detection delay. 15 minutes is an eternity in an escape. Every minute becomes distance and options. Viewer prediction question. If you're a deputy, and you realize someone may have fled, what do you prioritize first? Locking down exits and roads, or immediately pursuing on foot? Because that decision determines whether the escape turns into a sprint or a manhunt. Once authorities confirmed Bundy was gone, the response escalated quickly. But the terrain around Aspen made searches uniquely challenging. It's mountain country, dense forests, steep elevation changes, unpredictable weather, and vast wilderness areas where someone could hide for days. In searches like this, teams typically split their focus. Road units establish checkpoints and harden likely vehicle routes to prevent the fugitive from stealing a car and leaving the area. Trail and wilderness teams sweep hiking paths, access points, and areas where someone on foot might travel or take shelter. Residential checks focus on cabins, vacation homes, and places where supplies could be stolen. Tracking teams use dogs and scent-based methods where terrain allows. But here's the operational reality. In rugged mountain terrain, maintaining a perfect containment perimeter is extremely difficult. There are simply too many ways to move unseen. Too many ravines, too many tree lines, too many gaps. Bundy reportedly survived in the wilderness for several days, moving at night, stealing food and supplies from cabins, and avoiding populated areas. He was injured from the jump, which slowed him down. He was exhausted, and he was increasingly desperate. On June 13th, roughly 6 days after the escape, Bundy made a critical mistake. He attempted to steal a car in broad daylight in Aspen. A police officer noticed the erratic driving and initiated a traffic stop. When the officer approached, Bundy tried to flee on foot, but his injured ankle gave out. He was tackled, handcuffed, and arrested. Ted Bundy's first escape had lasted 6 days. He was returned to custody, this time under far stricter conditions. He was placed in heavier restraints, denied privileges, and placed under constant watch. Authorities believed they had learned their lesson. They believed Bundy was now contained. They were wrong. After an escape like that, institutional response has 2 paths. Patch the obvious hole and hope it doesn't happen again. Or redesign the risk model and assume the person will try again using a different method. The operational fixes needed after the courthouse escape were concrete and specific. Tighten restraints policy. High-risk defendants should remain in handcuffs or leg irons during any movement, even during legal preparation, unless the room is fully secured and continuously observed. Enforce true line-of-sight supervision. Not a guard in the hallway, but visual contact at all times. Harden access points. Any room used by a detainee should have windows that cannot be opened, or windows with reinforced barriers and alarms. Shorten confirmation cadence. Staff should verify presence frequently, not only at scheduled check-ins. Controlled movement protocols. Defendants shouldn't drift through public or semi-public spaces where escape routes multiply. Because be more careful isn't a system. A system is controls that remain strong even on a busy day, even when staff are distracted, even when someone appears cooperative. After his recapture, Bundy was held at the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. The jail was older, understaffed, and not designed for long-term housing of maximum security inmates. And while security had increased after the courthouse escape, jails like this often have architectural vulnerabilities, utility spaces, ceiling gaps, ductwork, and areas where inmate zones connect to staff-only zones in ways that weren't planned for security. Bundy studied the building. Over several months he observed routines, learned staff schedules, and identified a structural weakness. His cell had access to a crawl space above the ceiling. That crawl space led to other areas of the building, including the jailer's living quarters located directly above the cell block. But there was a problem. Bundy had gained weight in custody, and he was too large to fit through the narrow ceiling opening. So he went on a diet. Over the course of months, he deliberately lost a significant amount of weight, reportedly around 30 to 35 pounds. Guards noticed he was eating less, but assumed it was depression or stress. They didn't realize he was preparing. Bundy also accumulated resources. He had roughly $500, smuggled in by supporters and visitors over time. He obtained civilian clothing and hid it in his cell. On the night of December 30th, 1977, Bundy made his move. It was late evening, during a holiday period when staffing was lighter and attention was divided. He climbed onto his bunk, removed a ceiling panel, and squeezed into the crawl space. He crawled through the narrow passage until he reached the area above the jailer's apartment. The jailer was out for the evening. Bundy dropped down into the apartment, changed into civilian clothes, and simply walked out the front door of the facility. No alarms, no guards, no confrontation. He walked into the snowy Colorado night and disappeared. And here's the part that made this escape exponentially more dangerous. It took staff approximately 17 hours to realize he was gone. By the time they discovered the empty cell, Bundy was already out of the state. He stole a car and drove to Denver. From Denver, he flew to Chicago. From Chicago, he took a bus to Michigan, then made his way south to Florida. By the time authorities knew he'd escaped, Ted Bundy was over 1,500 miles away. And in Florida, he would kill again. Ted Bundy arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, on January 8, 1978. He rented a small apartment near Florida State University, using a fake name. He had money, freedom, and access to a new population of potential victims. On the night of January 14th into the early morning of January 15th, 1978, just 2 weeks after his escape, Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In less than 15 minutes, he attacked 4 women as they slept, using a wooden club. 2 of them, Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20, were killed. 2 others, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, survived with severe injuries. Shortly after leaving Chi Omega, Bundy attacked another student, Cheryl Thomas, in her apartment just blocks away. She survived, but suffered permanent hearing loss and other lasting injuries. 3 weeks later, on February 9, 1978, Bundy abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school in Lake City, Florida. She was his youngest known victim. Her body was found weeks later in an abandoned structure. These crimes didn't have to happen. If Bundy had remained in custody, if the jail had been properly secured, if detection systems had worked faster, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach would still be alive. That's the human cost of institutional failure. On February 15, 1978, a police officer in Pensacola, Florida, pulled over a stolen Volkswagen Beetle for a routine traffic violation. The driver acted suspicious and tried to flee, but was apprehended. When officers ran his information, they realized who they had. Ted Bundy, the escaped Colorado inmate, now wanted for multiple murders in Florida. This time, there would be no escape. Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders became a media spectacle. It was one of the first criminal trials broadcast live on national television. Bundy, ever the narcissist, acted as his own attorney again, cross-examining witnesses and delivering statements to cameras. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bite marks on Lisa Levy's body matched Bundy's teeth with forensic precision. Eyewitnesses placed him near the sorority house. Stolen credit card records tied him to movements across Florida. On July 24, 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was later tried and convicted for the murder of Kimberly Leach and sentenced to death again. For the next 10 years, Bundy sat on death row, filing appeals, giving interviews, and eventually confessing to 30 murders across 7 states, though investigators believe the true number was significantly higher. On January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. He was 42 years old. Ted Bundy's 2 escapes in 1977 are remembered because they were audacious and public. But the real story isn't about cleverness or daring. It's about systemic failures in risk assessment and institutional response. The first escape, the courthouse window jump, exposed how easily appearance can override threat assessment. Bundy didn't look dangerous. He looked like a lawyer, and that appearance bought him privileges that didn't match his actual risk. The second escape was more calculated and more troubling. Bundy spent months planning, physically adapting his body to fit through a narrow space, and exploiting a structural weakness that should never have existed in a facility holding violent offenders. But what haunts families and investigators most is what happened after. Those 17 hours of delayed detection gave Bundy the distance and time to cross the country. And that delay cost lives. Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, and Kimberly Leach didn't die because Ted Bundy was unstoppable. They died because systems failed, multiple times. And those failures compounded. Today, Bundy's escapes are taught in law enforcement academies, in corrections training programs, and in criminal justice courses. They're studied as warnings about the dangers of complacency, about judging risk by appearance, and about the critical importance of rapid detection and systemic adaptation. The lesson is clear. Security systems must be designed for worst-case scenarios, not best-case assumptions. Final question for you. If this defendant walked into a courthouse today, with modern surveillance and procedures, what's the one control you think would stop him first? Restraints, secured rooms, continuous observation, or faster detection systems? Tell me in the comments. And if you want the next case file from the Escape Files, subscribe and let me know which escape story you want next. Thanks for watching.